Hi, everybody. Привет. Я очень рада быть здесь сегодня на Zoom. Спасибо все.
Спасибо, Joanna. So we will be speaking English today. Occasionally we'll slip in some Russian words. I'm so excited to greet you all here. Joanna's new book is called Red Wave, an American in the Soviet Music Underground. Their publisher, DOPPELHOUSE Press from Los Angeles. It is available in Globus Book. For today's event, you have a rare chance to get a signed copy. This is Joanna in one of many photographs that she shared with us today. And Joanna, when I was reading your book, it struck me that your story of life and love in Russia was akin to this aha video of the song Take On Me, you know, when it's all odds and ends and big hair and the cities and the countries that don't exist. And your memoir is such a good reflection of that strange and bygone world. So here we have two worlds, that USA and USSR, that seemingly incompatible at the time, and here you are in the 80s trying to bridge it all together. You are doing right now what you've been doing then, and it's only logical for us at Globus to have you here with us today, because we are doing the same. We are bringing people together, building a bridge through literature, through books for us, and through music and rock and art for you at the time.
Уходишь так рано и приходишь так поздно домой. Я скучаю целый день, я смотрю в окно. Я хотел бы все время быть только с тобой, но пока я без тебя, и в душе моей темно. Живешь на четвертом, а я на шестом, и обертки от конфет пролетают за окном. А когда ты уходишь, я смотрю тебе вслед, обернешься или нет, я махну тебе под голову. когда в доме тихо, я слышу, как ты поешь. Я пытаюсь тебя подыграть, но никак не могу подобрать мотив. Засыпая, я вижу твои глаза, но они говорят мне нет. Удивляюсь, как еще я жив. Любовь — это не шутка. Ты знаешь, я не шучу. Любовь — это не шутка. Ты знаешь, я не шучу. Любовь — это не шутка. Ты знаешь, я не шучу. Любовь — это не шутка. Ты знаешь, я не шучу.
So I want to start by just saying a couple of words about the culture that we had, because I happen to be a part of that, or maybe rather that was a part of my life at the time. This is what you see here now is a Rubinsteiner 13, which was a rock club where we just went to sing along and try to dance, which was kind of illegal, with Kino, Aquarium, and so forth. And we used a special language. We didn't go to a concert. We went to a session. A lot of things at the time were illegal. Kvartirniki, which was a concert or session at a private apartment, was illegal because people collected 1 ruble or 2 rubles to buy equipment, and they actually risked going to jail for that. And also just being a musician and not being employed also was illegal. You could go to jail for that. So most of musicians had to work as operators of boiler rooms and clean public baths like soy, or work as janitors. And some of the musicians who were mostly men, and we will talk about that, had to register themselves in psychiatric clinics in order not to be sent to a slaughterhouse in Afghanistan. So keep that in mind when you look at this amazing and bright pictures that we're going into right now. This is the crowd that we used to see, and perhaps you will also find yourself there or find somebody you used to know there. I know I always look for that. And here we go into my first question for Joanna. And that wouldn't be, however, about the rock club yet. This is about your family history and this amazing connection that I discovered reading the book. Your father, Sidney Fields, directed the film called The Truth About Communism in 1968. And there are some incredible connections there. You see Alexander Kerensky here at the very bottom of the slide. And of course, some of you know that Alexander Kerensky is this historical figure, the head of the provisional government that was taken down in 1917 by the Bolsheviks. And so he presented the film introducing the truth about communism.
17. Mr. Kerensky consented to make a few introductory remarks about our picture. We present 80-year-old Alexander Kerensky in his New York City apartment on October 10th, 1962.
Ladies and gentlemen, in a few minutes, you will see the documentary movie of the development of communistic movement throughout the world. The majority of this audience is too young to remember that this communistic movement began in 1917 during the First War in my country, in Russia. I was, in this time, leader of this provisional government of Russia.
And I was wondering if you have ever met him. That would be such an incredible connection. And also Ronald Reagan, of all people, is narrating in this film.
Most of the pictures in this documentary were photographed by communist cameramen as the actual events were taking place. Communist narrators interpret some of the scenes. The words of the communist leaders are their own. Hello. In the traditional motion picture story, the villains are usually defeated. The ending is a happy one. I can make no such promise for the picture you're about to watch.
And as we can see, you did meet him. And can you talk about that a little bit? And I know that you said for you that film was propaganda. I watched 1/4 of it or 1/3 of it, and it kind of ran true right now. And it was also very heavy, and I had to stop. Did your friends know about that? Did Bergen know about it? Did Soy and, you know, so the Sologubs know about this film? What did they think about it? Because I thought Kurokhin would have a field trip with it.
Yes, first of all, I did not meet Kerensky. My father was working on this film from the early 60s, throughout the 60s, and he was very passionate about letting America know how dangerous communism was and how evil it was. And I was, of course, very young when he was making this film, and I just remember his warnings: don't ever go behind the Iron Curtain. We did end up meeting Ronald Reagan, who was the governor of California, again, being very young and not being interested in politics. I thought, okay, we have to stand here and meet this man. I don't think I or my two sisters felt the importance, as we do now looking back, of meeting the governor, who then became president and was just as passionate about spreading the truth of communism as my father was. So it was a very big deal to my father, and his film was later on shown at many high schools and TV all over the United States. I remember in the 70s at my high school, it was shown a couple of times. It's a very scary film, and obviously there's a lot of truth in the film. All of the footage was footage that my father bought on the black market from the cameramen in Russia that would smuggle out the footage and sell it in the West. But then when I flash forward to my own time in Russia, I realized that documentary was very narrow, very one-sided about a particular thing, about the politics. But when you saw the film as an American back in the 60s and 70s, it made you think that was all of Russia. So it made you terrified of Russia, of the people, of everything. And as I learned later on, thank goodness, I saw a whole nother different side of the Soviet Union. I do not remember, I'm sure I had maybe mentioned the film to Boris, but you know, I didn't pay attention. You know, you're kind of in the moment. I didn't really think about or remember that film until after my father died, and I ended up with all the big reels and everything, and much later on. So I don't think I brought it up to Victor Tsoi or to many of them. It's only recently in the last 10 years that I kind of swung back around to this connection to my youth that leads in some weird way for me going in my 20s to Russia.
You also used some of the footage of that film in your own clip, didn't you? Sometimes in the 90s, right?
I did. So when involved in doing music videos, I had known about MTV from obviously when I was home in the States. And so I was very just motivated to make videos to all of my songs. So I made a lot of videos. And when I got to the song City of Lenina, which was a song from Games, and I sang it with English lyrics, I thought, oh my gosh, my dad has this footage. And the songs, you know, has to do with Lenin. And I used the footage in the video. And I thought at the time, with my connections at the Russian TV, and I had already become popular, that it wouldn't be a problem airing it. And it literally took us 2 years to get it edited because, you know, communism had fallen, but Lenin was still kind of an icon. And so they weren't ready to touch anything that had to do with Lenin that made it funny. We had him moving backwards. We had him on the screen with me, so a rocker with Lenin. There were numerous things in the video that I now understand crossed the line that they were not ready for. But I love that I got to go full circle and use some of my dad's footage for that video.
And this is a question about the influences of Western music on the Leningrad rock club culture. Well, there are some obvious ones, and you mentioned them in the book. So Bowie, David Bowie, and Bageo Grebenshchikov. And then you did mention this encounter, so we brought this picture, which I think very few people know of. And there were other connections too. I know that you described Grebenshchikov once as Russian Bob Dylan. Have they met? And also there are connections of other groups to other Western groups like The Cure, the New Wave groups, and so forth, Duran Duran. Can you talk about that a little bit? And also mention maybe the punk rockers, and I'm particularly personally interested in connection with, say, Nina Hagen, whom I loved at the time.
Okay, so this picture is actually the end of the story. This is in the 90s when Boris finally got to leave Russia and record an album in the US, and he finally met one of his heroes, David Bowie. But when I met Boris and the rest of the rockers when I was 23 years old in 1984, I was amazed that behind this suppressed country that from the American press, that's what I and everybody else thought, I was amazed how much they knew about Western culture. And of course, when I started listening to their songs, being a Westerner, I would kind of identify, you know, that Strange Games was like Madness, the ska band, and Kinchev was kind of like a Billy Idol. And so that's a Western thing to kind of compare them. And Boris to me, when I first met him, definitely had the same kind of beautiful light energy and the look similar to Bowie. And he was influenced by Bowie. He was influenced by Bob Dylan. But Boris, more than any of the other rockers, because he was fluent in English, as well as being a ferocious reader, Boris consumed whatever Western culture he could get through the black market, through his connections with the Western consulates in St. Petersburg. So he read Allen Ginsberg, he read Kerouac. You know, he knew more about Western culture and poets and writers than I did. I was very impressed. But even with the other bands like Kino, who was very influenced by many of the new wave British bands coming up in the 80s, they were turning me on to music because the new British bands would get smuggled in to Russia before it would come to the US. So they would play music and I'd say, who's that? This is The Cure, don't you know The Cure? This is The Cult, this is The Smiths. So I was turned on to a lot. They had just a wide range of what they liked, all the rockers. I do remember hearing Nina Hagen a little bit. I can't remember if anybody was a huge fan of hers. I know many of them were fans of the Cocteau Twins, which I had no idea who they were. Fans of jazz, fans of blues, you know, they had such a wide array. And again, it showed me that when you're not allowed access to stuff, how hungry you are and how you become so innovative to figure out how to get it. You know, here in the West, we had so much music and access to everything. I didn't really care much. You know, there were a couple bands. I never really went outside, you know, my zone of loving Bowie and Alice Cooper and the Rolling Stones. And they really opened up my mind to look further at different artists that maybe were outside of the box and more like, you know, Nina Hagen is more like performance art. So I credit my Russian friends for expanding my mind with music.
Sounds about right, because we craved everything that, of course, was not available. I'm very excited about this next part of the interview because it's a very unusual review, tour, excursion of Leningrad Rock Club with Joanna Stingray. You were a part of it on stage. You were a part of Kvartirnikis. You were a part of this life. The groups that for a lot of us became legends, especially for those of us who immigrated. We took the music with us. It's a part of our, not just life lived in the past, but geographically, this is something that we left behind. So it's very important for a lot of people. And with excitement and trepidation, I am now scrolling into the next step. And as I was preparing for this interview, as I was sharing with Joanna, I made some discoveries. This is Victor Tsoi in the 4th grade in the school number 356. And this is the school. And I just found out yesterday that I studied at the same school with Victor Tsoi for 1 year only, because we both left that school. It wasn't a very good school. And here's me, and this is school 356. This is my house. And this is how the school looked. That's how the musicians were growing up, the rockers, the punkers. So when you see the photographs of the costumes, of their makeup, it will struck you as something completely different from this drab environment that we were surrounded with. And so this is the building that Tsoi could see from his first apartment on Moskovsky Prospect. And so, Joanna, back to you about Tsoi and Kino. Can you speak about them a little bit, or not a little bit, as long as you want?
Well, obviously most people know I became very close to Victor Tsoi and Kino. I was married to Yuri Kasparian, who was the guitar player in Kino, and Victor, Yuri, and Gustav and I really were a foursome, and I spent a lot of time with them. And for me, Victor, of all the rockers, was the most, lack of another word, just a normal person. He was so with his feet on his on the ground, and it was just very comfortable to be with him, to be friends with him, and he became such a wonderful, trusted friend, and he was just a beautiful guy inside and out to spend time with. The first time I saw him was at the Rock Club. There's a photo there of one of the photos from one of the concerts. And when I first saw him, the light came on him, and there was this very slow, driving, penetrating song. It was Tranquilizer. He just looked so stoic and magnetic, and his face would be a little to the side, but he'd be stomping a little bit, and he had this incredible jawline. And it was just such power that he exuded through the concert, and his voice was just low, that it would vibrate into your soul. So I was taken by the first concert I ever saw him play. And I also was very hypnotized by the music. Of all the Russian bands, he probably had the most hooks in his song. And I remember the first concert I ever saw, I'm watching the concert, and without knowing it, by the third chorus, and I didn't know a word of Russian, I was singing, Videli Nochkul, and I thought, what am I doing? You know, his songs got under your skin, and the loops got in your head, so it was very easy to get addicted to his songs. But he was just a very important person in my life. I feel so lucky that I met him, and I met him through Boris. Obviously, Boris was the first person I met who introduced me to more of the bands and the musicians. And here's Boris, and this picture, I think, really exudes the relationship I had with Boris. You know, with Victor, we really were like best buddies. We were very equal. I think this picture shows, if you look at my face, I am just in awe of Boris. I can feel his light and his spirituality and his, you know, he was so evolved. So I just wanted to be near him. It just made me feel better. And I really was the student, he was the teacher. And I think, again, you can see it. I spent many, many hours and hours at his communal flat, in his room and on his roof, interviewed him many times. I couldn't get enough of him. You know, I was very young. I was 23. I was very naive. I didn't know who I was yet. You know, I wasn't sure what the world was, what was my place in it. And Boris just seemed to know, to have some kind of connection of understanding about what it was all about. So for me, it was very important to spend as much time as I could around him. And he enlightened me and he opened up my world, and he's very much a part of who I became in my life. So I'm eternally grateful to Boris and his spirit. And just to make a note, I know my good friend that I grew up with is on this Zoom, Diana Isaac. She was somewhere in the front. But anyway, she is the one whose older sister was married to Andrei Falaleyev, who used to be one of Boris's best friends. So because of her, the whole thing with Boris started. So hey, Dee, and I'm grateful for that destiny of me ending up in Russia at the feet of Boris Gurbanchukov.
I think on behalf of all the Russian audience, we also have to thank Dee for making this introduction, because we all gained a lot from it. And I think, like you said, Bagay is such a big subject that we are coming back to him with more pictures and more questions. Another band that is also very special, it's Stranny Igry, or Strange Games, and one of my favorites. I have very oblique connections with all of them. One of my best friends went out with this guy, Viktor Sologub, and she's not with us anymore. She died a long time ago, so it's also a special memory. And regardless of anything, they were such showmen. You called them the best performers ever at some point in your book. And
you know, loved these Sologub brothers. So the right photo with the scar makeup on Vitya was actually the first rock concert I saw in Russia, because on my first trip when I met Boris, I saw an acoustic concert of his, and I saw an underground concert of him with Sergei Kurukin. So Strange Games was the first concert I saw. And I remember thinking, oh my God, these guys are fabulous. It was very much like a ska band like Madness, where it was 10 guys, there was a brass section, and they would be in a line and they would all be dancing and singing together. And it was amazing. But then it broke up, and Red Wave, by the time Red Wave came out, it had actually gone into two bands. And the Sologub brothers started Games. Games is some of my favorite music of the Russian bands, and it's because there's this always underlying foundation of a punk drive in their songs. And I always had that fondness for this kind of rock that has a little bit of punk in it. So their music in general to me was amazing and very strong. And then in concert, you know, they had probably the most energy of any band I saw, and they were very passionate. And as I wrote in the book, my favorite is Vitya Sologub doing Helter Skelter. It's just mesmerizing and gave me goosebumps. And then Grisha, his younger brother, would sing some songs, and his voice just had this mix of such pain and sorrow, but then beauty while singing the song. And you know, they're so interesting, because my feelings of Vitya that I loved, he was like the protective older brother. He was so caring and always thinking about Grisha. And you know, Grisha and I don't know Grisha that well because he didn't speak English. Vitya spoke really good English. So I didn't interact with Grisha as much as I did with Vitya, but it was such a strong bond between them as brothers, to see that love and just to see the attentiveness that Vitya gave Grisha. They were amazing. I love Games.
They also translated a lot of French absurdists and played with words. They were interesting to listen to. They were interesting to decode. Everything about them were fascinating. And I think we'll have some more photos right here. Where was that picture taken? The same concert, right?
That was the same. So this was my first trip to Russia. So this is when I first met Boris. I only had 3.5 days in Leningrad at the time. And after I met Boris, we spent a lot of time together, but he tried to show me whatever he could before I left. So this is backstage at the concert. You know, it was so interesting to see rock music with an accordion. You know, it just was different. It was very professional, very artistic. And again, the fact that they didn't have much and they didn't have access to Western things or Western outfits, I from the very beginning was blown away, the creativity to put on the makeup and to take clothes and cut it to make them look more punk. You know, they just were so incredibly artistic to make this little world. You know, the whole rock club and the whole rock and art scene in Leningrad at the time was really a parallel universe to the communist Soviet Union. It's like they made their own life in this bubble. So it was magnificent.
I have to say, echoing from what I said before, that even doing makeup was more difficult than doing makeup here because we didn't have any makeup. It's probably lipstick he's using, or, you know, sometimes we would use charcoal. Or here I want to show, this is something that I found in my archive. And for the life of me, I do not know who took these pictures, which I think are beautiful. It's possible that it's Vladimir Bystrov, one of the photographers of Rock Club and my friend, but so much time has passed. I don't know, they're just in my album and I thought I would share it. If you took these pictures, or if you know who took them, please contact me and I'll be happy to give credit. Here's one of the very happy pictures. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, obviously this is one of the iconic photos from the video I Got You Babe. And Boris and I, after we met and had this huge bond, I was obsessed with just getting back to Russia. So for the first 2 years that were still under communism, before Gorbachev came, I would come home, I would work at a travel agency just to get another ticket to go back on these one-weekend tourist trips. So naturally of just hanging out, again, my favorite Russian word is tustовка, spending a lot of time doing nothing, which is a very un-American thing. And it was, you know, just, you know, it sucked me in. I wanted to be part of it. Boris and I would start fooling around with music and ended up writing some songs together. And then somehow we were joking and singing a little of Sonny and Cher's I Got You Babe. And I said, you know, we should record this. And we did record it. I recorded in the studio here the music and my voice, brought it back to Boris. He listened to the finished recording in a Sony Walkman and sang into a second Sony Walkman. I took it back and we flew his vocals. I don't know how we matched it up, but we flew it in the studio. And then when I came back, we decided with my sister, who was with me on many trips, my sister Judy, and again, another person I'm very grateful to make a video. And we shot Boris and I in Gorky Park in the winter, and there was nobody there. And then we came back to our hotel, the Cosmos Hotel, and decided that we would shoot a scene in the bathtub, and it was a big bubble bath. And of course, it became very infamous when people started to see it, and later on when people had the internet, because they thought we had some big romance and it was very sexual, and it wasn't. It was a very different connection. But yes, it was a very, everything with Boris was fun. You know, it was always in the moment. Every time I asked Boris, hey, want to do this? Why not? That was his phrase, why not? Whatever crazy idea this young American could bring up, he would just always say, why not? So it was fun.
And you can read more about it here. Joanna writes about all this and how it led to it and so forth. And I have to add that at the time, that was really shocking because we didn't even have any films with nudity in them. That was unheard of. So just to put it in the context, because for us now, it's like not a big deal. But at the time, it was. I have another question, which is a bit difficult because I also grew up with this adoration of Bagel, like we all did. And I loved the poetry. In fact, I found some handwritten copies of his lyrics in my box preparing for this interview. But in your book, you also mentioned that in 1987, after you took the music and the tracks out of the USSR to make the Red Wave records in the West, in the USA, the KGB became very interested and agitated and contacted all of the musicians and wanted them to sign a paper saying that you pirated or stole the music. And most of the musicians found the way to dodge it and either ran out of town or did something not to do it. But he did. And you're very gracious and accepting and understanding of it, because of course at the time the KGB permeated every structure that we had, including the rock club itself, and it was very difficult to resist it. And yet I would like to hear, what did you think of it then? How did you process it? Because it created a lot of problems for you. You couldn't come back to be there for your own wedding.
Yeah, you know, it's very complicated, and there's, as anyone that grew up in the Soviet Union or Russia knows, there's just layers of things you have to deal with of growing up in that place. You know, I write about a lot of it in the book, but in short, what I can say is that, you know, relationships and friendships and family is very complicated, and nobody really knows what's going on between two people, a husband and a wife, a teacher and a student. There's all these different levels of relationships. And, you know, Boris was just somebody that is such a part of who I became and helping me find myself, that I just knew in my heart that if he had to do it, if he had to sign against me, there was a reason. He wouldn't have done it unless he had to. And, you know, living in a communist country, you're put in situations that make it very, very tricky. And there's big losses that can happen and things that can affect your family. So you know, it's a very complicated thing. I know most people were angry and most people couldn't understand how I still loved Boris and never held that against him. You know, for me, Boris was the light. He still is the light.
Well, that certainly takes a lot of wisdom and understanding, especially for somebody from the US, to reconcile with that. So yeah, that was...
Well, thank you. And I think I got that wisdom and that understanding from him. So again, it's all convoluted. But yes.
Yeah, and then of course there was no black and white. We were all pushed one way or another into some sort of conformism, and we all tried to escape it. And he did it the best he could because he gave us hope and inspiration. What year was that taken, Joanna?
I believe that's 1985, and that was on the roof of his friend's apartment in Moscow. You know, it's just really amazing how much time in those days in Russia you would spend on the roof. And it's because many people lived in communal flats, and they would, you know, inform the KGB, there was a foreigner here, this is what they were doing. So we did spend a lot of time on roofs. So here we are.
Yeah, well, in St. Petersburg, I also have memories of spending a lot of time in Paradny, in Paradnyak, which were the stairs where you hide from the freezing temperatures outside. So this is obviously in the summer. So the next group is a group Televizor, which is probably not as known, but Mikhail Gorbachev is an outstanding songwriter and a special figure in Russian rock. Probably one of the most problematic lyrics for the set KGB were written by Televizor, and he started this group in our school. We went to the same school. A little quote from him where he's saying, in the 9th grade, we started a school group, which I remember. First, they were playing at some parties at the school, and sometimes they even had to skip the classes to play because we had a lot of visiting Americans and Westerners, and so they would perform for them. And he describes the physics teacher who used to hate him, and I remember this teacher who he pretty much hated everyone. And so here you could see, this is one of my friends dancing at this party. This is the logo, and we were trying to wear our hair in a punk manner, which meant just shaving our, you know, like going all the way through half of the head. So here is a Televizor, Mikhail Gorbachev, and you combined him with Zvuki Mu.
Yeah, Televizor came a little bit later. So I was there in the beginning of 1984. The first bands I really met and saw was Aquarium, Kino, Strane Igra, Zoo Park. Then the next band I saw was Elisa. And then a little bit later, a year or two later, I started to see Televisor. I was not as close friends with Barzykan that I was with the other rockers, but I did do an interview with him, and I did see a couple of his concerts. And, you know, it was interesting because he really had a different style, and all these bands really had their own style. And he really had a lot more techno. It was like rock with a techno beat. So it was much closer to new wave that was going on in the West in the 80s. So it was very interesting. I do know that a little bit later, towards the end of the 80s, you know, he had some very controversial songs, and he was much more blatant than the earlier bands, Kino, Aquarium. He was much more blatant in his lyrics, either being anti-political or being against something. You know, with Elisa and Aquarium and Kino, I found that it wasn't direct lyrics speaking about they're unhappy with the government or happy with this. It was more about life. You know, my favorite thing in an interview I did with Kosta Kinchev is he said, you know, people have to stop looking at their feet. They have to look up to the sky. You know, it was much more this subliminal feeling of energy in the universe. Barzykan was one of the first ones that was much more blatant, which to me was much more of a Western style to be blatant with lyrics. But again, he was doing this, you know, in a communist country as it was going into glasnost, so it was very dangerous for him. So he was very, very bold. Another band that I completely adored was Zvuki Mu. We had become friends with Sasha Livnitsky in Moscow. Every time we went there, he hosted all the Leningrad rockers, and we ate and went to his dacha. And he was almost like the father figure for all of the Leningrad rock club, Sasha Livnitsky. And he was obviously the bass player in Zvuki Mu. And Peter Mamonov, who's the lead singer in this photo, was really insane. And to me, I saw some similarities of a David Byrne, you know, very eclectic, very out of the box. And the fact that this was happening under communism behind the Iron Curtain was really baffling, because just his movements and his quirkiness, you know, everything demanded your attention. He was so outrageous, you weren't sure what to think or what to do. But it was very exciting to see these bands, and over time there were more bands, DDT, which I love, and Yuri Shevchuk, and Nautilus Pompilius. You know, the rock club was really the center of all of it, and it was a magic that just happened, and then it just kept spreading throughout Russia at different rock clubs. So again, I think all the bands had such a uniqueness and such interesting music and lyrics that you couldn't turn away. It was an exciting time.
Thank you for bringing it all back. I mean, the way you're speaking about it with such passion. You can feel that in the book when you read it. I read it in one breath, and I was so busy I couldn't possibly be reading, and yet I did, and it's a thick book. I mean, I really recommend it.
Yeah, it looks like a thick book because it's two parts. In Russia, there were two books, kind of the one period, which was Leningrad and the underground rock scene, and then the second period where it's Moscow and glasnost and capitalism, and I had my own career. So the English one's put in two, but it has a lot of photos, I think 150 photos, and I'm eternally grateful, and I know we'll talk about her later, my daughter Madison Stingray, that she co-wrote it with me, because people say it's very easy to read, and that is her poetry, and she's really a phenomenal writer. So I'm blessed to have had her collaborate with me on this.
I really felt it was written by a musician. It's a magnificent tour, and it logically takes us now to the band that kind of united all the bands, the mother of all bands, or the queen of all bands, which of course is Pop Mechanica and Sergei Kuryohin, and yet another miracle. So I found another old photo in my archive. Again, not sure who took it. That's just how it was. You know, whoever had a camera took it. Probably Vladimir Bystrov, maybe not. Again, if you know, if you took it, let me know, please. And you could see here, again, this is Grisha Sologub, Victor Sologub, and Kuryohin.
Oh, I know that's my photo, and I gave it to you. It doesn't matter when you put that photo up. I just light up just to see that face. You know, there was nobody like Sergei. He was the maestro. We called him the Capitan. And he was so brilliant. He knew he was brilliant, and he spoke about it not with an ego. He just knew, you know, I'm genius. I'm smarter than everybody else, and I know this. again, he was an incredible person in my life, and again affected who I am and who I became. And you know, he was a mad circus. I don't know how he ever slept. His brain never stopped. I spent hours the first couple of years when I went to Russia at Boris's, with Boris and Sergei, and then also our good friend Alex Kahn, who translated for Sergei because he didn't speak English, although you didn't need to, because Sergei would communicate, Joe, you know, he would just make a sound and somehow you would figure out what he was saying. But his musical brain and his creativity never stopped. His foot was always going. He always heard the piano all the time. But yes, he put it all together. He was the mother of everything. And, you know, he chose musicians from all different genres, from jazz, from rock, from blues, and he would conduct and put this stuff together. And sometimes when I first saw some of it, I would think, what is that? What is that noise? And all of a sudden you would just understand that this noise was poetry, that it was incredible. So he just had no lengths to what he could imagine, and you could give him any space, big or small, any kind of musicians, and he could make it into something that was so eclectic and so interesting. And, you know, it reminded me of what I had seen in movies and read about the 60s in the US, this kind of experimental performance art, which I never really knew anything about. But that's what Sergei was doing. And now I see why it was so addicting in the 60s and hypnotic. And so many people got sucked in, because I got sucked into it too. It was incredible. And I was so lucky that later on I got to be part of it. And, you know, Sergei was by far in charge of it all. Whatever Sergei said or did, we followed. He was the Pied Piper, and we were all happy to just trail behind him.
Yeah, I remember Pop Mechanica Garage Cirque du Soleil. There were animals, they were like something that you didn't know what it was. And there was Africa running back and forth in a dress and complete madness. And one of the things that I was thinking while preparing for this talk is that this kind of energy, I've only seen once again after that, and that was in Albuquerque in a high school in a gym at the underground poetry festival where the local band played, and it was mad, just like that. It totally brought me back. And I was wondering, and Albuquerque is a very stressed economically, you know, with a lot of creativity and art. And I was wondering, is it something about being in this condition that brings out this talent and brings out this thirst, and that is impossible to recreate even in San Francisco, which is magnificent and a great music scene? And I've been a lot to Seattle, to punk rock concerts, which were also very vivid and bubbling with energy, but it was nothing compared to that. What do you think it was?
You know, I think in general, hardship brings out a certain level of creativity that you don't get when everything's just relaxed and easy. So I think you get a lot of, you know, very excellent music and art coming from places that have a lot of horrible and horrific things taking place, and that life isn't as easy. So I think so, and that's always the big question in my interviews that I do with the 80s, when I would ask them about what they thought of Western bands, and most of them in their interviews loved the American rock from the 60s, and then the new music in the 80s from Britain, because they thought that the American music from the 80s became very much a treadmill of big business, that bands had huge contracts for millions of dollars, and they knew that once you have that connection, that it's a job and you're getting paid a lot of money, even subconsciously you start doing what you know will make the boss happy. It kind of takes away what I call the freedom of spirit. And what the underground bands had at that time was complete freedom of spirit. They didn't make money from their music. They couldn't record in official studios. They couldn't release official records. They didn't care. They could be 100% pure in their expression of what they felt in the inside, because they didn't have to do it for anybody else but themselves. And again, I think it's the purest form of art when people are doing it first for themselves with nothing attached to it, no rules, no money, because that does change everything. So that's why I think when we look at the American rock in the 60s in Laurel Canyon, in Los Angeles, and in New York, and in San Francisco and Monterey, I think those musicians that started out then had that same thing. I think they were completely free. There weren't big contracts yet. They really collaborated. What I loved about the bands at the Leningrad Rock Club is they were all playing in each other's bands. There was no competition. Somebody would write a new song, and instead of holding that song that it would be out, no one would hear it. There was no really out. It was put out on cassettes with your friends. So when they wrote a new song, they would go over to Boris and play it for him. They would go over to Victor and play it. There was a lot of collaboration. And of course, Sergei was in everybody's band. He at some point almost produced every band. He played almost in every band. So there was a real kind of communal atmosphere in what was going on in those days. To me, it felt very hippie-ish by films I'd seen about hippies in the 60s, just the communal living, the sharing of ideas and thoughts. Again, Tusovka, spending time doing nothing, which was a lot of intellectual jargon. It just was energizing.
I was thinking right now that if Kurokhin were to speak at the show, of course, which for those who don't know, he died young, long time ago, he would make a complete joke out of everything.
The minute you said that, I heard his voice saying, "No, she's not true. It's bullshit. It was nothing." That's exactly what he would have said.
Yeah, none of it would fly. I never met Kurokhin personally. I mean, I saw him on stage, but for me, he was like one of the most full of light in that crowd. You could see the light emanating from him. And that's why here comes my other difficult question. At some point towards the end of his life, I wasn't in Leningrad already at this point, he started to hang out with a very different crowd. He is with a very dark figure who is very alive and active now, Alexander Dugin, who is an open fascist and neo-Nazist. Now, at the time, more or less, he was too, and they were operating something which was called Natsboli or National Bolsheviks, and it really hit me hard. I couldn't figure out what is going on. And this is my one chance to find out from somebody close to the source. Do you have any comment on that?
Again, at that time when he became friends with Limonov, and I heard it only in the last few years because I was already in Moscow with my own career and doing a TV show, so I didn't see him as much. But just even seeing his face here, I can feel this is my friend. He's not a fascist. But what I can say by not having concrete evidence, because again, I wasn't around him at that time, is he loved shock and he loved to cause problems. So for me, it's not unusual that he would hook up at some time or another with some very controversial figure. He never wanted to be put in a box. And so when things were presented in front of him, if he felt the motive, energy to see what it is or be involved in some way, it was very Sergei. I don't think my friend deep down was a fascist at all. I don't know much about this period. I do know in 1987, after I got back in Russia, after being an enemy of the Russian state and missing my wedding, when I did get back in, we played on Music Ring, and I was with Sergei and Yuri Kasparyan. And afterwards, we took questions from the audience, and I remember one person asked a question saying, you're saying you wrote these songs with her, but these songs sound like Western pop songs, so there's no Russian in these songs. And I remember Sergei got really offended and said, what are you talking about? And how can you judge anything? I'm Russian. So it means I wrote the songs with her. It means the songs are Russian. So again, he loved to spar with people. He loved conflict, unlike Boris, Boris always liked calm. Boris never wanted anybody to be fighting. Boris never wanted to be part of any disagreement with people. He really just wanted everybody to be happy and peaceful. Sergei was the opposite. He stirred it up. He wanted it, and that was part of what fed his brain, that kept it sharp and kept it, you know, fighting and debating.
Well, that makes sense because, you know, most of us or some of us in the audience remember the Lenin was a mushroom prank and all the other pranks that they were doing. So I was just thinking it was a prank, and I want to believe it was a prank and the scandal and the...
Yeah, there was no boundary that Sergei wouldn't cross, that's for sure.
Another group that kind of is in a shock area here is Alisa. So can you speak about Kostya Kinchev and Alisa?
Yeah, you know, I was at the Rock Club and saw the first bands I told you. And then in '85 at the Leningrad Rock Festival, that was in March, Alisa played, and Kostya was from Moscow. I learned later through interviews, and he came and became a lead singer for Alisa. And I remember the first concert at the Rock Club, you know, his energy and his movements made all of us melt. He just had this commanding performance, and he would twist and he would, you know, sing looking at you as if he was looking right at your eyes into your soul. And he was even like that off stage. When I did interviews with him, he would be looking straight at me with such piercing eyes that I thought he was looking into my soul. So, you know, Kostya was a very powerful presence, and he had a real sexuality about him. You know, he was almost the type that could melt boys and girls. You know, he had a real sensual aura to his being. Yeah, I wrote in the book, and you can read more about it, but I found him to be very cat-like. You know, his movements, and it's so perfect, you can see here, but just talking with him, and you know, he wasn't like me where I'm bubbly and I have a lot of energy. You know, he has a very low voice, and he speaks with meaning, and he likes to listen. And when you're speaking, he's really looking at you and taking it in. So I always felt that he was some kind of cat.
Yeah, it really shows in this picture. I love this picture. You also see the satin, like you see the background of this gray monolith of most likely Leningrad, could be Moscow too.
Yeah, it was the balcony in the apartment of Alex Kahn. We had just finished doing an interview where Alex translated for me because, again, Kostya and Slava Zindera did not speak English. So Alex was a great help throughout a lot of this time period.
Now we cannot not speak about Africa, and this is a beautiful photograph, so I'm going to fold for a second too. This looks like Andy Warhol's painting.
Yeah, you know, Africa was really, you know, a world of himself, and he was a whirlwind. He had more energy than anybody else I've ever met in Russia. He was very young. He came up from the South on his own, left home, and he had such just a young spirit and you know, so curious about everything. And to me, I used to call him like the mayor. He was the mayor. He would organize everything. You know, he took my sister and I on all of our trips there. He would take us to more new things to see. Come meet this physicist, he's so cool. Come meet this artist that's not the contemporary artist, but a different kind. You know, he really was like our tour guide. He just took us to so many interesting things. His energy never stopped, which is why he and Kurokin got along fabulously, because both of them just had ideas coming out of their head. And, you know, he was one of the few Russians that also was very street smart. And Africa could figure out how to get anything, how to get in everywhere, you know, very different than Victor Tsoi, who would not ever do anything to try to manipulate or finagle something. Africa was the great manipulator for good and for all of the rockers. And if it meant getting us into, you know, a restaurant that Russians really couldn't get in, if it was trying to get foreigners on a Russian train that we weren't allowed on, you know, Africa could get anything done, and he could get everything. So I don't know how he worked his magic, but he was, Africa to me is like his own world.
And again, more about it in the book, because of course we are limited for time, but they're wonderful fables. One of the things that I would like to ask is, again, for some of us, I'm going to fold for a second to show the posters of the film Asa, which was a cult film, still is, I suppose. At the time was very unusual. I heard all kind of things about it, that actually Africa didn't like it, Soy didn't like it. I heard that Solovyov, the director, was inspired by the car accident that you were involved with. There are all kind of rumors. As always with a cult thing, there would be a lot of talk. So what is your take on this film?
Well, first of all, when Asa was happening, the filming, that's when I was an enemy of the Russian state. So unfortunately, I wasn't there. And if I was there, I probably would have been able to be on set and be part of more of it. So really, my memory and lasting impression of Asa is like the rest of the world, is that when the film came out, you know, the film was interesting, the story was interesting, but it was the last 4 minutes that blew you away. This scene of Victor Tsoi and, you know, coming out as if he's going to work in the restaurant and all the rules, and then going up and starting to sing, and the camera turns and you're in this big open concert. And the power of that scene, I think, changed everything for Victor. From that one scene when Asa came out, Victor, who was already, you know, rising up in his stardom in terms of the underground rock club, you know, just shot up here from that scene in Asa. And that to me is my memory of Asa. And then of course, just everyone always calling Africa banana, banana. But, you know, again, I wasn't there during the filming. I met Solovyov after that. He was in LA at one of my art shows, but I wasn't as close as I probably could have been if I was there at the time. But it certainly was a pinnacle in Glasnost and the changing that was happening in Russia, the film and the whole script of the film. And that the rockers were involved. There was Aquarium music in the film, other musicians. So, you know, Solovyov was a visionary. He understood what was happening in Russia and that the time was ripe to do this kind of film and bring in these, you know, so-called underground rockers that hadn't gotten any respect before that. So it was an important film, and will always be an important film.
Yeah, for our American viewers interested in music and who are not familiar with the film, I recommend watching it. I believe it exists with English subtitles, probably even on YouTube. It's very beautifully done. The cinematography is beautiful, and it's a detective story, and it's a clash of generations in some sort of communist fathers and sons, and where the sons are represented mainly by the Leningrad Rock Club musicians, or somebody who either the musicians are playing them as actors, or they are there playing their music. And I really recommend it. It's something different. And as Joanna is saying, it was this turning point where there was some shift in the societal movement. This is Mike Naumenko with Park.
You know, I met Mike again through Boris, who introduced me to all the rockers, and I saw him at the rock club. And I remember thinking, really cool band, and it reminded me of you know, American rock mixed with blues, you know, similar to maybe like the Rolling Stones. He had the mirrored aviator glasses. You know, I thought the music was great. I never became close friends with him. I did a nice long interview with him, which was interesting. And I remember when I would ask about him once in a while, because I was told that he was one of the godfathers of Russian rock with Boris. So I did know how important he was in the Russian rock scene, but he didn't seem to be hanging around as much as all the other musicians. And especially when I came, I was a magnet, because I was the American. I would bring all this crazy stuff. So when I go to Boris's, everybody would come. And I didn't see Mike too often, only once in a while. And I remember I did ask once, oh, I don't see, you know, that Mike's not around a lot. And somebody said, oh, well, he's just an alcoholic, which I found that to be a weird answer, because everybody I met in Russia seemed like an alcoholic. There wasn't anybody that wasn't drinking beside me. So I didn't know him as well as the other bands, but I do know his place in the history of rock and roll. And Boris was very close with him, obviously, and the other rockers. He was, Kosta Kinchev, I think, was very influenced by Mike. So he's an important part of the history.
Again, one of my very oblique connections, I once, having not been able to get into the concert in Rock Club, ended up drinking beer with Lyosha Ryba, who started Kino with Soy. And he was obviously very drunk, so were we. But what I remember that he was complaining that he was not a part of it anymore. And I remember that Mike Naumenko was the god. So it was a big part of the story. And he was considered one of two.
One of them for sure, but it was actually Boris.
Yeah.
Who brought Victor Tsoy into the rock club.
Yeah.
But yes, but again, like I said, they all collaborated, helped each other. So I'm sure Mike did too.
One more stop before we go on the round of other questions. We had to touch upon punk rock. Can you talk a little bit about Ricochet and the objective?
Yeah, I don't know how we ended up. Somebody must have told us there was a punk band by now. My sister and I were filming a lot of the concerts at the rock club, doing a lot of interviews, and we had heard about a punk rock band, so we wanted to see it. And we went to Ricochet's apartment and filmed them kind of rehearsing. And it was really crazy because it just was so much like punk anywhere. Punk is punk. Same way mothers are mothers everywhere. Punk is punk. And it was crazy. And they were rehearsing and they were getting wild. And Yevgeny and Ricochet. And somehow Ricochet broke a mirror and ended up cutting himself. And there was blood on. It was just amazing to see because to me, there was no difference. It was the energy, it was the whole vibe of just punk. So there's just some internal similarity to punk and where it comes from. And I know later on, they were allowed to play in a couple halls, but this, I believe, was in '85, and they were really still underground. So it was amazing to see. And Ricochet had this beautiful movement. He almost seemed like a ballet dancer. He moved very freely in these movements. So it was exciting to see them.
One question that I have after hearing all of this and looking at the pictures is, where are the women? We've seen a lot of talented men, and I'm trying to think very hard, and except for Zhanna Aguzarova, ashamed as I am, I can't remember anyone.
In my first interview I did with Boris in April of 1984, I asked him in the interview, are there any female rockers? And he said, no, I would love to see that, but unfortunately it's very old-fashioned here. So he had told me that right from the beginning. And then I didn't notice any. I knew about Zhanna. I never saw her perform because she was in Moscow. So I didn't ever see her. Later on, I saw a couple of performances on the TV, and she was so interesting. And she wasn't straight rock. She was very eclectic and a mix almost of a performance artist. But as you can see in the photos, I was very happy being with all the boys. And, I always had this philosophy that I'd rather be one of the guys than with one of the guys. So I preferred to be hanging out with them. And I never thought very often, oh, I'm a girl and they're guys. I just loved hanging out with them. And, I got to hang out with them most evenings. And when I was writing the book, I felt a little guilty that I didn't put more time into really becoming friends or learning more about their lives. I really was like a kid in a candy store. And I was just so taken by all of them, and the fact that they seemed to grab me in to be part of their group. I just had a blast. So again, for whatever reason, and like Boris said, the Soviet Union was still very old-fashioned, but I was lucky that I was able to become a rocker. And then later on in my career in Moscow in the early 90s, you could see by most of my fans were young teenage girls, and I think that's because there weren't any other figures for them to look up to, a strong girl singing rock, being on motorcycles. So I'm just grateful that I got to do all this.
And I think it's probably for me and for my girlfriends, we needed some woman figure too, along with all the coolest in the world guys. We wanted to have somebody else who was more like us, and Nina Hagen was one of them, and she was a woman. Well, it was marvelous the way it is. You know, you can't go back and look at it and say that was not right, or you don't measure it with what we feel or know now. It was what it was, and it was incredible and magic and brutal and sometimes ugly, and it just and that's how you describe it too. And here comes my next question, and it's a wonderful picture that I love. About how fearless you were. You were very young and you were very different, and you were coming to a completely different world, as the audience can see in this picture. This is a typical kitchen for that time, and most people's kitchens look like that, and to an American eye it looks different. And this was not the scary part. The scary part was the KGB, the stuff that I mentioned in the beginning of the show, psychiatric clinics, the army, things being illegal, the lack of things, the lack of dignity, the lack of light, all of it was there, and you just went into it and you had no fear. So what was it? Was it just this invincible youth, or did
you know, I think it was a mix. First of all, it all came from the passion that overtook me when I met Boris and met the rest. The passion was so strong, and the energy of what was going on there really got into my blood, and I had to be there. And so that just kept bringing me back. And I just think when you're young and passionate, it never crosses your mind, the danger. You just do it. You're not even thinking about it. And of course, now being a mother, if my daughter was ever doing what I was doing, I would be very nervous, as my mother was. But you know, I paid a high price for that fearlessness. And like we spoke earlier, I had my visa declined. I couldn't get in for my wedding. I couldn't see any of my friends. And that day, there's no internet, no cell phone. So when I was blocked out of the Soviet Union for 7 or 8 months, I had almost no contact. It was heart-wrenching. My whole life had been pulled away from me. And this photo is when I snuck in after 7 months from Finland for 7 hours on a boat from Finland. And it's the first time that my mother met Yuri and Victor and Boris, everybody in the same day. And this is Boris's communal kitchen, and this is where we spent so much of our time, and on the roof of Boris's. And it was a great moment to go back and see Yuri for 7 hours and to have my mother be part of it.
Yeah, and we can see in these pictures in the front, that's your mom, right? And then Yuri in the back, right? And you could see Victor.
And
not to give it away, you'll have to read the book, but there's a love story there too, when Joanna couldn't get back into the country and couldn't get married, and that was very romantic and dramatic and tragic, and you'll have to read all about it. And by the way, your mom is fascinating, her character, like overall, and what she was doing for you and with your sister, to the whole family.
Yes, she was a powerful woman.
And here, speaking of fear, here you are balancing on the roof again.
The roof, time on the roof. This is that same trip that I came in for 7 hours and went up in the roof. And I love that this picture's up there because everybody knows the rockers and knows who they are, know their names. But Alex Kahn, who's here in the middle, was such a big presence during those days. And he was a jazz critic and a rock critic. And he was a real intellectual, and he was best friends with Sergei, but he also became friends with all of us, and then became very close with Boris, and very close with Boris even now. And he was such a big part of my life, and helping me translate, doing interviews and meeting new rockers, because I didn't know Russian in the beginning. And, you know, we hadn't spoken for a couple decades. And then it came around when I wrote the book that I didn't want anybody else to translate the book. The Oz State Publishing in Russia said they have a person that could do it, and I said no, it had to be somebody I trusted, and Alex did it. So we've become very, very close, and he's really a big part of this whole Leningrad art and rock scene. He just doesn't happen to be one of the rockers himself, but I love that we have this picture so we can show him. But yes, this is us on this roof, and this is probably the 100th or 200th time I was on this roof with these guys. That was really just part of our hanging out and being able to speak and sing up there. Good memories. And from this roof, this is Boris's roof, you have the Church of the Spilt Blood right behind it. So when you're on the roof, you're looking at this incredible architecture and the beautiful colors, and then the tragic story that goes with the Church of the Spilled Blood. So it's just a perfect symbol of what Russia was at that time and what we had to deal with.
You mentioned some people who were part of this circle, but not necessarily musicians. And earlier you brought up tusovka, which means hanging out and spending time together. But the other meaning of this word is the group, the company, the circle. And so in that tusovka, there were a lot of thinkers and artists. I know, and you describe it in the book, you brought their work to the West as well. And all sort of people, creative or more like administrative, who helped and made it happen.
Yes.
Yes. Alex Hahn is one of them, and you quote him in the book, and I found this quote quite interesting, so I want to hear your take on it. He said that, explaining it to your mom, I believe, when you got back on the boat, and she couldn't believe that the KGB and the government of the USSR would consider young girls so dangerous to them. And so Alex Hahn is trying to explain it, and he says there are people who are very nationalist and say they are trying to preserve Russian culture, the Russian spirit, and for them everything which is coming here from the West is in itself decadent. Rock is the purest manifestation of them. And later you mentioned that Kuryohin was appalled at the idea of the national rock. And so in that sense, the Leningrad Rock Club was very cosmopolitan, even in the way it embraced you at the time. And then you brought Red Wave to the United States, making it even more global in the way. So how does it fit into the modern conversation of globalism versus tribalism versus nationalism? What is your take on it now, and what was it then?
What I found then is that rock music had no borders. You know, there's a similar spirit, a similar vibe, a similar intent of people that feel music inside them and need it to come out and express themselves. So to me, as Boris once said, that it was a powerful tool that we had to use as a bridge to bring the USSR and the United States together. And I think it was a powerful tool then, and I believe it can still be a powerful tool now. You know, there's so much as humans that bring us together, so much more that brings us together than divides us. And unfortunately, a lot of time, the things that divide us get the most attention or are put out there more often than the things that unite us. And I think music is just one of the most important ways to have this connection, because even in the beginning when I didn't know the lyrics, the way somebody sings it, the music, it touches your soul and it affects you. And, you know, I could tell when Kostya Kincha sang that he's a prolific lyricist, even though I didn't understand his lyrics, there's still a vibe. And you have to remember that all Russians, as many people around the world that did not speak English, all of them were affected by the Beatles, and they did not speak English. You know, rock and roll can transcend everything and just go deep inside you. So, you know, there's a lot of things going on in the world, and let's just hope that some interesting music rises up again and helps us come together and have more understanding between people.
My next question is a spin on this one, and it's you are saying in the book that music is above politics, and it certainly was at the time, although at the same time the KGB was trying to manipulate Rock Club to control our minds, to only allow the lyrics that were approved. And these days there's often time that culture in general and music in particular are being weaponized and used as a tool of brainwashing, of propaganda, and also politics in some way becoming more fashionable than music these days. Like when you look at the very young people, what's trending often is something political versus the unpolitical themes of the rock and roll then and Leningrad Rock Club scene. So what do you think about that?
You know, it's a complex question, but I will say Leningrad of the 80s was not blatantly about politics. Most of what they were writing, Victor, Kostya, Boris, was about finding yourself and looking at the conflicts you have within yourself that's stopping you from doing things. So I think that real rock and roll and pure rock and roll, I don't think it can be used as a weapon. I think rock and roll that's used as a weapon are sometimes people that want to make a statement or want to get hits because they're doing something that's very controversial. You know, I asked Boris back then why they didn't sing about politics. And he said, because you get nowhere. You sing something political and everybody's into it for 1 or 2 days, you forget about it. But if you write songs about life and about vision and about searching, everybody can identify with that. You know, that lasts and that touches you in a much deeper way than something blatantly political does.
It's a very complex question. That could be a subject for the whole other. If you look back at what you've lived and where you've been and where your journey took you, would you change it? Would you do it differently, or would you just leave it the way it is?
You know, I understand that everything I went through, the good and the bad, brought me to who I am today. And now that I'm older, I do understand that hardship and tragedies put layers to who you are, so it makes you wiser and it makes you deeper. But I wouldn't lie if I didn't say that I wished all my friends that have passed away didn't leave. I wish Victor was still here. I wish Sergei was here. I wish Timur Novikov, so many of them. So I would wish that to be different, but I understand that can't be. So, you know, I'm grateful for my experiences in my time to Russia, and it'll never disappear because it really did become who I am.
The book is co-written by your daughter Madison, who only recently got to meet Bagher Grebenchikov and the gang.
Yes, we were going on a trip to Europe. I think it was 2018. And right before we left, a couple weeks, she said, I want to go to Russia. And I said, no, we've already been there. We're trying to get new countries. We had a game on our list. But she had this magnetic pull to wanting to go to St. Petersburg. We did go, and as you can see on the right, we met Yuri. She adored him. She thought he was the sweetest soul ever, and she met Sasha Tsoy. And it was so amazing to see the son of one of my best friends and my daughter on this boat chatting, and they would be laughing, and then they would be serious, and then that's Yuri's wife, Natasha, who's amazing. So she met them, and then I had Boris and his wife were over for dinner, but Maddie went to the ballet, and she was so sad she missed him. And Boris said to me, why don't you come by before you go to the airport? I'll be at my apartment. And so we went to his apartment, and we sat down to have some tea, and there's my old friend that I love, and somehow he asked Madison something, and she said, oh, people can be so mean. And Boris said, but Madison, your life is like a play, and you're the director. So if they're mean, fuck them, just get them out. And I saw my daughter's whole face change, and I had a flashback that it was 35 years ago, me sitting in Seva's apartment, meeting Boris the first time, and he just sucked me in, and I wanted to be near him. And my daughter was completely taken by Boris the way I was 35 years. And it was the most incredible scene I ever saw. And it was from that meeting, with meeting Yuri and meeting Boris, that when we left, she knew I had hired a writer to help me write the book. And there were three chapters, and she said, okay, let me read that. I was asking her, I knew she was a fabulous writer, and she wasn't interested. You know, it's mother's life, who cares? But after she met them, and she was standing in St. Petersburg and said, I can feel it, I'm Russian, because her father's Russian. And she read the chapters and said, I could write it much better. And I said, give it a try. And then this magic came, and I hired her. I got rid of the other writer, and she wrote the book with me. And she spent hours watching videos, watching all of my friends, especially the ones that passed away, to see how they spoke and how they moved. And to me, she really brought magic to the book and made it come alive. I think that when people read the book, hopefully they can feel what it felt like for me to be in that period with those incredible people. So very grateful to my daughter. And Boris gave her this skull ring, and she wears it all the time. She just feels such a connection to Boris.
Hi, and hi to Mark Yaffe, who invited me to this.
Love Mark Raw. He's amazing, and I met him at an event in DC, and he came. That's who introduced you, right? Mark?
Yes.
Well, I was at this event, and he was just so cool because he came up after, and there was a panel of different people talking about how different things, how Western rock helping down the Iron Curtain, and he was so cool because he walked up to me after, and he said, "You were the only one that told the truth here. You're the only one that knows what you're talking about." He was very cool. So I respect him and I like him a lot. But
yeah, I did an article for a book he edited. I'm not a punk rocker. I'm probably 10 to 20 years older than most of you. My main thing is like British folk rock and world music. But this is a really fascinating story about a particular time and a particular place with a very distinctive scene in it. I was really taken with your quote. I tried to make notes on this. Rock and roll has no borders, is a powerful tool and all that. I'm Jewish. I have met performers from places like Morocco and Egypt, and I got a real kick out of that. I am really curious about the political aspect, and I myself am very alternative, left-wing. I think to some extent that capitalism as we know it is destroying the planet. But I'm also aware that people in places like Russia who have lived in this very oppressive form of a collective type government may run screaming from anything that seems even remotely like socialism or communism.
You know, again, my experience with being there in the 80s and dealing with these bands is that there's a way to put the importance on the spirit and on the soul. And it was more searching, even though they were living under communism, it was almost that they were separate from that. You know, behind closed doors, people were smoking pot, they were doing drugs, you know, they might pierce their ears. And yes, they could be arrested for that at different times, but it was something that we all do. We're all trying to figure out what's our purpose. Why are we here? What can we do to feel fulfilled? What can we do to make a difference? So again, to me, I didn't find it political back then under communism. I found it, you know, in so many ways, very freeing to be there. You know, I grew up in Los Angeles, and you know, being brought up in the States, this is just, you know, an example, you know, from commercials, from TV, we all, you know, grew up thinking, oh my God, am I fat? Do I not look good in these clothes? And, you know, Russians, that never even crossed their mind. And that was obviously because they had a lot to deal with, but it was also their mindset. And so to see these women that sometimes were very heavy, wearing, you know, clean dresses and just dancing sexual, in some sense, I question, are they freer than we are as Americans in some ways? So, you know, I just found it intoxicating to be around people that had such freedom in their spirits. And that's what drove me to keep going back there.
How many of these performers are still active? I was really curious about the band with the accordion player, because a lot of the music I like is modernized interpretations of traditional music. And there's interesting stuff coming out of Russia and the Ukraine right now. And I wonder if you're aware of any of that.
You know, about half of the rockers, unfortunately, have passed away. And, you know, one of the interesting things I found by being in Russia and then eventually living there, so that I really was living like a Russian, was the differences between the way Americans lived and Russians. And one of them was that Russians were very in the moment. And they never thought about the next day. You know, if I would give Boris a bottle of vodka, it was drank that day. If I gave him 10, he'd invite over a bunch of people, it was drank that day. You know, they really were in the moment. And I found that as an American, we spend a lot of our lives for the future. We're working so hard to save for the future, for our kids to go to college. We're working so hard to save money for healthcare and to eat right so that our health is good. So I really found that on two extremes. And I always felt, in the end, leaving Russia, that somewhere in the middle must be the right way to live, because, you know, being in Russia forced me to be more in the moment, which I really am not by nature. But on the downside of that, many of them passed away because they didn't think about the future or think about eating right or not drinking too much. So many of the rockers are not around. The ones that are around are still very famous. Boris is the same person he's been since I met him 35 years ago. All he wants to do is record songs and play. And he goes to all these cities and plays concerts. He can't even wait till the concerts. And in the day, they just set up in the metros and start playing. There's wonderful videos all over the internet of people with their phones with Aquarium playing on the street, playing in the underground, and then they play their concerts at night. So, you know, Boris hasn't changed. He's a pure artist. That's all he lives and breathes. Kosta Kinchev is very famous in Russia. He has a whole huge, they're called the Army Elisa, are his fans. He's big. DDT is still big. You know, the big question in Russia is always, are there any new artists of the last 25 years that have reached the status of these old rockers? And there really hasn't. When you think of Russian rock and talk about it today, there's been a few people that have made some marks. The people that are still the most famous are the ones from the 80s. You know, you have Pussy Riot, which is really completely different. It's not a rock band. My issue with Pussy Riot when I first found it is they're very different than the bands that I dealt with, where they had a message they wanted to get out, and they knew to get the message out, rock was going to help them get out. So they did some extremely, you know, extreme performances and setups. And the biggest problem, unfortunately, that I had with Pussy Riot is I didn't like the music. There was no good music. So, I mean, again, that's iconic. Pussy Riot definitely in their own genre did something very important, but it's very different than rock and roll. If you're talking about rock and roll in Russia, I think most people still bring up Aquarium. Kino sells more records in Russia now. He's passed away 30 years ago, and he sells more records in Russia. They sing his songs in Belarus during the protests there. So, you know, good rock and roll, as we know, lives on forever, ever, as does the rock and roll from the American 60s.
Right.
Hello. Thank you for your wonderful story. It's very beautiful, and it's just really nice to see all these old pictures when people so young, so like vulnerable, so like energetic, and it's just an amazing time for us. For me too, because I was living at this time in St. Petersburg. Even now I live in Maui, but I still feel like it was a great time being there. My question is, how is the meeting with these people, which was definitely like something very outstanding about them, and thanks God that Boris Grebenshchikov is still around and doing a great job with his songs and new albums. But how the meeting with these people, being so close to them, affect your life? Probably you miss it when you have to go back to live in America.
You know, as I said earlier, I realize now in writing the book that so much of who I am as a person now are from these people, you know, mostly Boris Grebenshchikov, Sergei Kurokhin, and Victor Tsoi. Those three, more than any others, really affected who I became and who I am. And I just feel, you know, so grateful that fate brought me to Russia. So I love promoting their legacies because they're so important, especially my friends that have died. So I love that the book, you know, helps keep their memory and their spirit and everything they did alive. So I hope people enjoy it too, but I really ended up writing the book for my friends because I needed to show the world how magical they were.
And thank you for doing this, because these three people is my favorite too, and they affect my life a lot, and make me who I am right now in some point. Even I didn't interact with them as close as you did, but for me it was enough just to listen their music, their song, their interviews, and I think what you're doing is great. And maybe right now is not the greatest time, but I'm sure that maybe our grandkids, our kids already, they come back to the people and see that something was so amazing about them, about their energy, about their way of life, about everything you was talking about. And yeah, it's just really amazing that you was right in the point. Thank you, Jan.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jana. Thank you.
Irina's question, did you interact with any women in music in Russia? We spoke about it a little bit, but maybe there's something else to it.
You know, I didn't. Again, I never saw a concert of Joanna Arguzarova. No, the closest I came was probably Africa, and his dresses and his makeup and his earrings. So unfortunately not. You know, when I had my own career in Moscow, of course, you know, there was the whole pop scene, and Alla Pugacheva, who was so famous, and then some other pop stars, but in the rock world, no, not really.
Hi, Joanna.
Hi.
Stella here. Actually, a little bit of a confession. I do remember your career pretty vividly, because I was growing up in Belarus, and my older brother was a huge fan of Leningrad Rock Club. So he was following everything, and his whole wall was covered in Viktor Tsoi. So once your videos started coming on TV, we loved them immediately, and we were really happy that you were gonna promote Viktor Tsoi in US, and it seemed like a whole new path for Russian rock music at that time. But my question is, since you got a taste of music recording so early, do you ever feel like recording music now? Do you write or do you compose currently?
You know, I left Russia in 1996 when I was pregnant with my daughter. When I came back, the latest album I wrote with my second husband, Sasha Vasilyev, was probably my most professional and my best or most prolific lyrics. And I did get offered a record deal with American Record Company, but I had just had a baby, and the last thing I wanted to do was go on the road. So I kind of passed that up, and then became a full-time mother. So I didn't really do music, except for my daughter has always been an amazing songwriter, and I take her in the studio and I've recorded a lot of her songs. And she finally put out an album about 6 months ago under Stingray. And to me, she's an amazing writer, and that's all I've done. Music, I'm in the middle of dealing with a record company in St. Petersburg that puts out archive stuff. So we're going to put out some archive stuff. I have the first album coming out is 10 songs I wrote with Gorbachev in 1985 that I never released, that we wrote together and recorded back then. So that'll come out. I don't know about doing new stuff. I do miss it sometimes, but you know, I always collaborated. So I worked with people that wrote the music, and then I would write the lyrics, or we'd write the melody together. And since I divorced my second husband, you know, in whatever it was, 2000, I just haven't had that collaboration. And again, you know, living in the States is very different than living in Russia, and it's very expensive to live here. And I have a nice house, and I live in a nice area. So for me, I've been working 3 different jobs just to maintain my lifestyle. You know, it's to live a nice life in the U.S. It takes a lot of money. So I do miss it, and maybe it'll come back around, and I'll do it. I know that Yuri has asked me if I wanted to write a song. We thought we'd write a song called Flashback about our early days. So maybe that'll happen. We'll see.
Awesome. Thank you. I just follow up a little bit. I read on Wikipedia that you worked for Berkeley Hills education board or something like that?
Beverly Hills, the alumni. I went to Beverly Hills High School, so I just run the alumni, which I can do at home. Everything I do, I don't have to be in office, thank goodness, so I can run around and do it on my own time. But yeah.
Cool. Well, I moved to California myself 12 years ago, so I'm an American citizen now. But I do come from over there.
Good. Congratulations.
Could I also ask you, what do you think about the singer Zemfira, or if you ever heard of her or her music?
I haven't heard of her. Is she now pop or rock?
Oh, she became a rock star in the 90s, late 90s.
Yeah, when I left. And when I left, you know, again, people forget, when I left in 96, there was no real internet yet, no cell phones. You know,
I remember that, yes.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm from Mexico City, and I have worked in my own project for 5 years, artalmarusamx.com, that is art and reference in Mexico. And I eventually ended up hanging and interviewing underground music in Moscow for the last 3 years also. So I'd like to ask how the underground music scene has developed in Russia, in the main cities in St. Petersburg and Moscow.
If I'm correct on the first question, it's about the limitations of Russian rock becoming famous in the West because of the Russian language. And I will say, and I write in the book about this in more detail, but people feel that it's good rock, and people were very into it, and there was so much press when Red Wave came out, but it was limited of how popular it could be because it was in the Russian language. And of course, Russian rock is so much about the lyrics and the you know, writing in between the lines, because you're under communism, to be writing where people are guessing what you're saying. And so the lyrics are a big part of it. And I did learn when I ended up later on after Red Wave, I ended up having some art shows from all of the Russian underground art that I brought out. And the interesting thing is that the art was fabulous art, like the music was fabulous music. But the art, unlike the Russian music, was just looked at like, wow, this is incredible art. People didn't keep the Russian label to it because there were less boundaries, because there wasn't a language blockage. So the art actually was, when it was at a level of good art, just became great international art. The rock, people enjoyed it and they liked it, but it was always referred to as Russian rock. So there's no question there was a limitation with the lyrics. Now, I think the one person that Russian rocker that could have made it in the West was Boris Grebinchikov. He did have an American record deal with CBS in 1990, and unfortunately his records, Radio Silence, didn't become as a hit that it should have. But I wrote many songs in English with Boris, and he was the only Russian that was just as good as a poet in English as Russian. He was really an incredible poet in English. And for whatever reason, the stars didn't align when his English record came out. I thought Radio Silence was a great song, but maybe it just was Dave Stewart produced it, and maybe it would have been better by the time he had a record deal here, that it was more folk rock, which Boris has always been the basis of his art. So I think some Russian art, rock and roll, could have made it here, but I think it just didn't. I think people like Elisa, Kosta-Kinchev, who doesn't speak English, and Victor wouldn't sing in English because he has a big accent. You know, they were Russian artists. I think they would have been happy to be famous here, but on their own terms. You know, you have to remember that most of these underground Russian bands, especially Aquarium and then Kino, were offered to be professional many years in Russia, where they could have made a lot of money, had their own apartments, had cars, and they gave it up because to them, they didn't want all the strings attached to being an official band. Above everything, they wanted to be free artists. So I think that again translates that if somebody came to Victor and said, oh, your song is such a hit song, we're going to give you English lyrics, can you sing it in English? I don't think he would have done it, you know?
I wanted to ask how scenes were connected, or if they were not, during the USSR from Leningrad to all the Siberian punk scene, with people like Yegor Lietov from Grasdskaya Varona, and if Joanna was able to meet up with people from this scene, if Leningrad scene was somehow connected with this scene, or if they were like different worlds. I don't know how these scenes worked out. I mean, Russia is super big. But,
right, okay, so The Leningrad Rock Club was the first one in '81, and it was by far the most iconic, and it was really the hub of Russian rock and roll, and that's why you had Kinchev move there from Moscow. Eventually, Yuri Shevchuk moved from Ufa. So then there was a rock club in Moscow. There was one in Ufa. So it started, there were 3 or 4 main ones, but the first one was Leningrad. So a lot of the bands became known from that were out in Siberia and all over by coming to the rock club festivals. So it was all out of Leningrad in those 80s, especially in the mid 80s. And, you know, that's where you wanted to be and that's where you wanted to play. There was the Moscow Rock Club, but, you know, Zvuki Mu was the hippest band ever out of the Moscow Rock Club. And there was maybe 1 or 2 others. It wasn't, to my memory, many more than that. There's things that happen and you only realize it in the past that become an iconic history. And just like American rock music in the 60s, the Leningrad rock music in the 80s is totally, everybody knows now, this magical time in this magical place. So, you know, we were all just lucky to be there. And I think that vibe and that energy drew rockers from all over. Later on in the 90s, when I had my own career in Moscow, I did go tour throughout the Ukraine and many parts in Russia and Siberia. So I saw a little bit more, but most of the bands from Russia I saw play in St. Petersburg at the Leningrad Rock Club.
Okay. Thank you very much. Your book is going to be available in ebook, in electronic version, because I'm from Mexico and it's super expensive for me to access from.
It is on Amazon. You can buy it in ebook.
Ah, perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And in case you want a signed copy, Gabby, we do ship, and we do ship abroad. It costs a little bit more, but we can check for you. There's one question, as both for you and maybe your publisher. How do people get in touch with you if they want to interview you or write a review? What's the best way to contact you?
Well, they can either contact Carrie, the publisher of the book. And again, the book, you can get it on Amazon, you can get it in Barnes & Noble. Most bookstores you can order it from.
The publisher of this book, Red Wave, is Doppelhouse Press, Los Angeles. Again, it's available through the publisher and through Globus. You can also contact us. It's easy. You already followed us one way or another to be in the stock or listen to us. So get in touch. Maybe in some future we can do it in Russian for all your Russian fans. Or
and what I want is to do it in person at Globus Books. I love, and this is what I did in Russia many times, is to do it at the bookstores where people are there and they ask questions for an hour and then you see them or you sign the book. So hopefully we're going to end up at Globus Books when COVID goes away, whenever that is.
That would be absolutely amazing. We have the nicest, coziest, weirdest, quaintest bookstore that you would love. It's like, yeah, it's Wonderland of a sort. So I have one comment from Anders Nelson, who says, thank you, John and Zarina, from a student of Russian language who visited Leningrad in 1998 from an exchange program at Moscow University. The music will stay with us forever. And
oh, great. Thank you. Thank you, Anders.
So much. Thank you, Anders. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
I want to thank everybody for being here. And I say in all of my interviews now, because it just is meaningful for me, the quote of C.S. Lewis, that what you see and hear depends on where you're standing. And I am so lucky that I ended up standing in this incredible place in an incredible time. And I know we can't stand different places right now because of COVID, but my suggestion to everybody is when you can, go stand somewhere else for a while because magical things happen. So I hope everybody is safe, and I hope everybody has Russian rock music to listen to in these times of being stuck at home. Навсегда будет русский рок-н-ролл. Спасибо. Мир и рок-н-ролл.
Thank you, Joanna. Thank you so much. There was the most marvelous 2 hours one can imagine in COVID. magnificent. Thank you, our audience. Thank you, people on YouTube, on Zoom, everywhere. And we bring to you City of Lenina.
Thank you, Zarina. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.